everyone, and welcome. Welcome, Terri. Welcome, conference attendees. We are so glad you're all here today. We have a really great keynote session ahead of us. If you can all believe it, we're nearing the end of our wonderful 3-day summit. I know it's been a lot of great sessions and a lot of really great networking, and we're excited to wrap it up with Terri Givens. Terri is the author, CEO, and founder of Brighter Higher Ed. Terri is best known for working with leaders to help grow teams and businesses by encouraging empathy and understanding in everything we do. Terri has over 30 years of success in higher education, politics, international affairs, and nonprofits, including roles as provost of Menlo College, vice provost at UT Austin, which is where I'm located today, in Austin, and positions on numerous boards. She will be joining McGill University in Montreal this fall as a professor and to assist in their anti-racism efforts. Terri, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks so much. And welcome, everybody. I am so excited to be here today. And so I really want to thank everybody at salesforce.org for inviting me to join you today. I'm really excited about this discussion. And of course, it's about my story. So my book, Radical Empathy, came out in February. And it's really my journey. And I really wanted to make sure that when I was developing this book, that I gave people an insight into my life. And so I start off with my family story. I am the youngest of 7 children. I grew up in Spokane, Washington. And Spokane, for those who don't know, is in eastern Washington state. And yes, so somebody mentioned the 509 area code. And my father was in the military. And so this first picture, of course, is all 7 of us, and I'm the baby in my mother's arms. And my father looking very proud of his family, which he always was. And so for those who don't know, Spokane is a very homogenous town. When I was growing up, it was less than 1% Black. But my parents found Spokane to be a great place to raise their family. And so they decided to settle there. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But one of the stories I really like to tell, and I only discovered this picture of my father in the second picture, or the black and white one, a few years ago. He passed away, unfortunately, in 2001. But I was looking through his things and found this picture, and that picture just really struck home for me. Here he was in 1962 going through his non-commissioned officer academy, and he was the only person of color in the whole group. And I realized, wow, this happened to be 2 years before I was born, but we're still experiencing some of the same things. So as a leader in higher education, and even, as a graduate student, I often found that I was the only Black person in the room. And so that really impacted me, seeing how he had that experience. And it also helped me to feel more empathy for him. And to understand that, he had a lot of challenges. Obviously, I knew he had challenges growing up, but this picture just really encapsulated a lot of the things that I felt he was probably experiencing as, a Black man in the military in 1962. So for those who don't know, the military only desegregated after World War II, and the Air Force was formed right after World War II. And so it was a new part of the military, and he joined in the early 1950s because he really wanted to basically be part of an important effort, and he was able to train as an electrician and in radar. But he really went through a lot of challenges. And so, the story I start off with in my book is, it's a family setting. We are having a family gathering, and my father is there with his grandchildren, and it's a really wonderful scene. But unfortunately, that was in May of 2001, and a few weeks later, he would pass away from a stroke. And so it was a very sad time, of course, for the family. But as a researcher, it also encouraged me to try to understand, he was only 72 years old, why did this happen to him? And, people always ask me why I decided to write the book, Radical Empathy. And one of the motivating factors was when I learned that just being an African-American male can be a risk factor for heart disease. And so I decided to start doing more research into that. And, I found out that there are all these risk factors that, are part of just being African American, including, risk factors around heart disease and just getting medical care is difficult. I wondered, did my father get the appropriate medical care that might have helped him to avoid having a heart attack? And so over the years, the next few years, I really started digging into these issues around health disparities and other kind of disparities that were impacting the African American community and myself personally. And so when you look at the book, you'll see that there are, I start off usually with my own stories and then talking about the data and the various aspects of our society that impact people, especially African Americans, disproportionately. But I want to switch next to talking about, if we can go to the next slide. Knowing your story. And one of the reasons I use storytelling, and I think the people at Salesforce are storytelling is an important component of their work. But I had to really take a lot of time to understand myself. And I really wanted to be vulnerable and to look inside and understand, there were some, I had certain feelings about growing up in Spokane, growing up, as I tell people, Black and Catholic in Spokane. My mother grew up in Louisiana, and our family is very Catholic, hence the 7 children. And I really felt that I had to understand myself before I could understand others. And, as I put in this quote, during my 20s, especially, I struggled with my own identity. And, if you think about it, I was growing up in Spokane, Washington, a place that was predominantly white. I was growing up also in the Catholic community, which was also predominantly white. We didn't interact a lot with people from other, African American backgrounds. And so I kind of felt like I was, distanced from that to a certain extent. And so especially when I got to college, I had to really extend myself to reach out to try to be more engaged with people in the Black community and the Black students at Stanford. And so it was really, in many ways, a struggle at times. And then after I got out of college, I felt like people were always not only that people were trying to put me into a box, that I was trying to put myself into that box. And so in the book, I talk a lot about the issue of internalized oppression, because if we think about it, we all live in this world where, unfortunately, structural racism impacts all of us. But we also tend to want to put people in boxes. And, I think it's important to understand how we've each been impacted by that, and how that has impacted not only our view of others, but our view of ourselves. So over the years, I had to learn how to be more accepting of who I am, making peace with the fact that I shouldn't make my self fit into anyone else's ideas of who I wanted to be and who I really am. So I felt like my 20s, I call them my years of cognitive dissonance. And it was a time when I felt like I was exploring and learning more about myself, but also just learning to be accepting of myself. And so let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So one of the things I tell people that we really have to think about is, what is our identity? And so I often will introduce myself by saying, I'm Terri Givens. I grew up in Spokane, Washington. I'm a mother. I'm a daughter. I'm a parent. I've been an athlete. There's all these aspects of our identity. And so, as you'll note, I have 6 steps to radical empathy. And one of the first steps is a willingness to be vulnerable. And there's varying levels of vulnerability. But I think, that understanding our own identities, and actually when I do my workshops, we have people to do an identity map where you actually take a piece of paper and actually draw out, what is your identity? And it's a way to get in touch with yourself, because I think oftentimes we don't take that step back and allow ourselves to say, who am I and what are the different components? And our identities are really multi-layered, Even though I'm African American, I know that I'm part white. There's Caucasian people in our family background, and what it means to be African American in society today. And so there even just that identity can be multi-layered. But also, what does it mean for me to be an athlete and to be active? And what does it mean for me to be a mother? So, I think it's important for us to spend time understanding our identities. And storytelling is a very powerful way to help people understand you, but also to understand yourself. That's why I spent a lot of time in the book telling my stories and starting with family stories. And I really dug in and started to learn more about, I'm the family genealogist. And so I spent time digging into all the materials I had from my parents. And even, the great thing about doing genealogy work today is that you can go to ancestry.com, and they actually have documentation. So like I found my parents' marriage license and the place where they lived in Los Angeles. So my mother's from Louisiana, but my father's from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and they met in Los Angeles when my father was transferred there as part of the military. And my mother left she was part of the Great Migration. And I always tell people, I love the book, The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson, because my mother came from Louisiana to Los Angeles. And there's a great storyline in that book about somebody who went from Louisiana to Los Angeles. And my parents met there in the 1950s. And actually it was interesting. There's a new movie out called The Banker. And I think it's on Netflix, but I'm not sure. And anyway, we watched it last weekend, and there was a scene from a bar in the 1950s. And I was like, oh my God, that's where my parents could have been, because they met at a bar in the 1950s in Los Angeles. And it was so cool to actually be able to visualize that. But in any case, these family stories can be so rich. And, I have spent, like I said, I've spent a lot of time trying to learn about my family and to tell those stories. But I also tell stories from my own life experiences. So, I talk about what it was like to be at Stanford in the 1980s. I talk about what it has been like to be an athlete and so on. So, so storytelling is, like I said, a very powerful tool to understand yourself as well as others, and to be able to share yourself with others by telling them things that they might not understand or know about you otherwise. So to explain the 6 steps to radical empathy, the first is a willingness to be vulnerable. And I modeled vulnerability all throughout my book. I can tell you that that's something that I don't have a problem doing anymore now that I've spent all that time writing this book. But the second component is becoming grounded in who you are. And for me, that was one of the bigger things I feel like I spent a lot of time on, because as I mentioned, during my 20s, I felt like I was going through these years of cognitive dissonance. And but becoming grounded in who you are allows yourself to do that internal work. And when we talk about working on diversity, equity, and inclusion, I really think it's so important to do that internal work, because a lot of the times when we're in these workshops and trainings, we talk about unconscious bias, we talk about structural racism, but the reality is we all have to deal with that. And it's not just about one group or another. We're all sitting in this world of, structural racism. And so we have to understand, how does it impact me as an individual? So, I'm a very successful person. I have had lots of great life experiences, but every time I walk out my door, I know that I start thinking, okay, is somebody going to look at me? I live in a predominantly white neighborhood. Is somebody going to look at me funny? And how do I need to act, and so on? So it's like and I don't know that we all understand or recognize it necessarily, but we all are impacted by the fact that we live in a society that unfortunately is still dealing with these issues. So once you become grounded in who you are, the next step is opening yourself to the experiences of others. And that is so important, because we all have to be open to understanding people's different perspectives and where they're coming from. And I really believe that, having radical empathy means that you are not just putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, but you're actually trying to understand the world through their eyes, right? Empathy can be, oh, I'm just going to try to understand that person by pretending I'm in their shoes, but it's kind of, there's that added step, it's not just how, I think they want to be treated. I actually have to be curious. I have to ask them, how do they want to be treated? So it's not just, that's why I say we have to practice empathy, but we also have to take action, because practicing empathy, and if you download the reading guide as well as reading the book, there I have lots of, at the end of each chapter, there's different actions you can take to practice radical empathy and different things you can do. And this is really about not just practicing empathy, it's about actually going out and doing something. And one of those things which revolves around this idea of opening yourself to the experiences of others is, finding a way to reach out and be curious, ask people questions. And believe me, I know sometimes you can feel uncomfortable, asking people these questions, but if in the reading guide, I have some guidelines on how to have these conversations, and even around race, these difficult conversations. So practicing empathy is really, all of this is very much connected to taking action. And then finally, it's about creating change and building trust. And I was having this discussion earlier today with somebody. We were talking about, well, I can take action. I can go for a march. And we just had the 1-year anniversary of the George Floyd murder. And the thing is we often take action, but is that action creating change? And there's so many different layers of action. And I'm not saying you shouldn't go out and march. That's very important. But what about going to your city council and asking what they're doing about racial profiling? I'm having my second meeting next week with our new police chief, because I want to find out what I can do as a community member to help him in helping them find new ways to deal with racial profiling and police violence. There's so many different ways you can take action, and I really do believe starting in your own neighborhood, in your own community, is really important for that next step of creating change and building trust. And so, it can be, talking to your neighbors, it can be, doing so many different things. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide, because, and if you guys have any questions about radical empathy, I'm happy to go into more detail or answer those questions. But one of the chapters, of course, talks about leadership and what does it mean to be an inclusive leader. And this is where you can really take action. And, people say, oh, well, what if I'm not a leader? Well, everybody's a leader in their own way. But actually, even if you're an employee and you want to see your leaders become more inclusive, you can help to create that environment. And ask your leaders to learn more about what it means to be an inclusive leader. So the first step is visible commitment, that they articulate authentic commitment to diversity, challenge the status quo, hold others accountable, and make diversity and inclusion a personal priority. The next one, and I want to mention that a lot of this has to do with also creating a sense of belonging. And I know the folks at Salesforce do this. So this is something that they work on and do all the time. And modeling humility. So it's really interesting when I talk to leaders about this issue of being vulnerable. It's like, yeah, but I'm a leader. How can I be vulnerable? It's like, well, guess what? We all make mistakes. Everybody. Nobody's perfect. And so if we're modest about our capabilities, we admit mistakes and create the space for others to contribute, we're improving the atmosphere for everybody. And I really think that's such an important component. And it's just so much tied into this idea of vulnerability. The next is awareness of bias. And you should show awareness of your own personal blind spots as well as flaws in the system, and work hard to ensure meritocracy. This is so important because, as I talk about in the book, we all have blind spots. I talk a lot. That's why it's important for me to be vulnerable, because I talk a lot about my own blind spots and my, the things I grew up with. We all have things that we learned based on how we grew up and so on, that we have to work past. And so, and really the first step is awareness. because people ask me all the time, what can I do? Well, the first step is being aware, understanding that we all have blind spots, being open to this idea that, gee, maybe, these things that happened when I was growing up, helped me to be biased now. And then the next is curiosity about others, which is, of course, this idea of being open to the experiences of others. So demonstrating an open mindset and deep curiosity about others, listening without judgment, and seek with empathy to understand those around them. The next is cultural intelligence. And this is something I was vice provost for international at UT Austin. And this whole thing of cultural intelligence is so important to me because it's not just about, black or white or brown. It's about being attentive to others' cultures and adapting as required. My research is on immigration politics, and but also having traveled the world, I'm very aware of cultural differences, and but we need to celebrate those differences, right? But we also need to adapt and understand. I was working with an organization that had people working around the world, and there was a tendency to focus like on U.S. holidays, but they didn't do anything about like the holidays in Europe or the Middle East. And it's like, well, we can be attentive to those things by talking about those other holidays, by adapting to other people's celebrations, right? Bring joy to our environment by bringing in those celebrations. And then finally, effective collaboration. Inclusive leaders empower others, pay attention to diversity of thinking and psychological safety, and focus on team cohesion. So what I would add to that is working on bringing a sense of belonging, because this is probably the number one thing I hear when people ask me, what can I do to, we just feel like we don't have that sense of belonging. And you create that sense of belonging by being an inclusive leader and by encouraging your employees to be open to each other and to make space for difference and for people to make mistakes and to do all of these things. So I would say that it's important. These are important for leaders, but these are also important for all of us who are working in any kind of environment. It doesn't mean that just the leaders have to do this. We all have to work towards things like, having a visible commitment all the way down to effective collaboration. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide, because I want to make sure I talk about some of the other issues that I know you guys are working on. So next slide. Great. So besides being the author of Radical Empathy, and I'm really happy to dive into more of that for those who are interested, I did want to talk a bit about the future of higher education. And so as you know, I was a provost at Menlo College, and I left that position 3 years ago to create Brighter Higher Ed. But I've also spent a lot of time doing a deep dive into what's going on in higher education today. And what I'm learning is that the world is changing quickly, and it's not just because of COVID. So demographic change, which in a sense is another reason why I wrote the book Radical Empathy, because I really believe it's critical that because of the demographic changes we are seeing in our society, broader society, if we don't start to address these issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, if we don't all develop radical empathy, it's going to be hard to adjust to the demographic change that's happening in our country. So, for example, we know that eventually we're going to be majority minority, but on the higher ed side, we also know that birth rates are declining, and of course, in the last year they declined even more dramatically. So there's that side of, they call it the demographic cliff. But on the other hand, there's also this sense that more and more people are going to need education. And so we know that it's not just that, we're seeing a decline in the number of 18 to 25-year-olds, but also, more people, as we look at, the increases in educational technology and the future of work, what the future of work means is that people's careers are going to go through change, right? You may be in one job for 3 years or 2 years, then you're going to go to the next job or the next career. That means that there's going to be a lot of people out there who need training, who need those classes. And one of the things I think we're going to really have to grapple with in more depth in higher education is that the people who need to be educated are not just the 18 to 25-year-olds. It's the people, it's the 30-year-old who is going to go and start his own company and wants to take some courses in entrepreneurship. It's the mother who has decided to go back into the workforce and got her degree 10 years ago and wants to refresh that degree. It's the retiree who is going into consulting and has been in education, but realizes they don't understand the latest in educational technology. And I have a personal example of this. My sister, who is willing to be vulnerable about it, she's working with me on these things, and she's been out of the workforce for 10 years, and she doesn't know the latest in learning management systems and so on. And so she wants that training. And so the future of work has so many different aspects to it, right? There's the issues of micro-credentials, and I'm a firm believer that every four-year institution, nobody should leave without some kind of credential, whether you stay for a semester or 2 years or all the way to 4 years. Everybody should leave with a credential. So I'm a huge believer in micro-credentials. I'm a huge believer that when you take a class, you be able to delineate the skills you got from that class so that you can tell your employer exactly what you learned. When your employer doesn't care about your transcript, they care about what you learned. And so the future of work, and Salesforce is right in the thick of this in terms of training people to use, to be techs, to use Salesforce. That's something that's really important going forward. And so I really see that there needs to be a greater collaboration. And again, the word, we're just talking about collaboration within a company, but there needs to be collaboration and greater collaboration between the field of educational technology and higher ed and just employers more generally. So when I was the provost at Menlo College, I made sure that I was reaching out to local employers. I mean, we're right here in the thick middle of Silicon Valley. It's a no-brainer to be reaching out to people in the ed tech space and technology more generally, but also it's important that we make sure that we're doing more work in terms of providing those pathways for students, and that students understand that. And this is it's interesting because this is all tied into the radical empathy perspective, because as those demographics change, as students from different backgrounds are entering higher education or getting training through the different boot camps and so on, we need to make sure that those who are providing that, people in educational technology, need to understand the demographics of the students. They need to understand the demographics of the workers and how we can address the digital divide, how we can address things that keep them from being able to be successful in those situations. And so I really, really hope that this has been such a wonderful opportunity, and I'm so glad that Salesforce focused on equity in this conference, because every single thing that we're talking about here in education is going to be impacted by our ability to increase equity, to reach out to those older workers, to those students who have families, to the students from different cultural backgrounds who need to feel welcome in those education spaces and in those working spaces. And so I truly believe the future of work isn't so much about the technology, but about the people and how we're working with those people to make sure that they can be successful. And so that's why I've also, the reason I started Briar Higher Ed is to focus on leaders in higher education, to make sure that they have access to the professional development they need to understand educational technology, to understand the challenges of demographic change and what's happening with the future of work. And I really believe it is through these partnerships with Salesforce, with different people in educational technology, that we can create the change that is going to lead to more success, not only in higher education, but beyond. Think more broadly of the post-secondary space. So in terms of nonprofits in higher education, so I part of my push and things that I do is working with nonprofits. And to me, I work with a lot of nonprofits that focus on equity, access and equity. I've been on the board of the Boys and Girls Club, and I'm also the board chair of the organization called Foundation for College Education. And one of the things I've tried to do is get these nonprofits to work together, especially around issues of college access and equity. And I live in Menlo Park, California, and I was just talking to the superintendent of the school district here about issues of equity. And unfortunately, we live in a place where we have East Palo Alto on one side of the freeway, and Menlo Park and Atherton and Palo Alto on the other side. And there's huge inequities in terms of access. And so we're really trying to work on those issues by providing opportunity for students to make their way into college, and to make sure that they have the same opportunity as on both sides of the freeway, as Highway 101, for those who don't know the Bay Area. But access and equity are another important factor for higher ed. And there's so many nonprofits out there that are working on these issues. And Salesforce has been a great resource for those nonprofits to be able to have access to the donor bases, and to create, there's so many different components of that are useful. But I know my own nonprofit uses Salesforce to track our donors and so on. But this is isn't just a cheerleading for Salesforce. I just believe that we all have to, as radical empathy is another component of this, where it's really important for those of us who do have privilege, who have had access to education, to make sure that we are providing support for these organizations that are providing better access and equity. But also in terms of the future of higher education, for those of you who are working in this space, it's really important that we have the ongoing support for the organizations like Boys and Girls Club and Foundation for College Education that are doing the work that are really going to lead us into the future. Because one of the things I remind people of is that we have to look at the future of our workforce here in California and across the country, and frankly around the world. And those demographic changes that we're seeing, the kind of the newer generations that are coming into the workforce are really going to be looking for those employers who are focused on diversity and equity inclusion, who help create that sense of belonging. And so, I always say there's a moral case for radical empathy and focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion. But there's also and I don't necessarily say you have to focus on the business case, because it's really what we should all do. But the reality is that our workforce is changing. We need to make sure that they're well trained, and we have to make sure that we're supporting our education systems so that these students are prepared to take on the future of work. So I hope you guys have some questions, because I'm happy to answer those. But I want to make sure I talk about some of the resources that are available. So of course, first is the book. And I know some of you have already received it, but if you haven't, please check it out. Annika has posted the resources guide. And so the resource guide I want to mention is, it goes beyond the book. The book also has a list of readings, but there's also a set of different videos and things you can read. And then I've been doing a series of podcasts. You can check out the book, the website, terrigivens.com. We also, for those of you who are in higher education, I encourage you to go to our community and join our community. You can follow me on LinkedIn, but we also offer radical empathy workshops, and those workshops are designed to be a 6-week program that walks you through this process of radical empathy. So thanks for posting the link, Annika. And Priscilla, thanks for your question and giving me the opportunity to talk about my father, because one of the things he always said we should there's 2 pieces of advice he gave me. The first was, always, work hard and just, always give your best, but there's a kind of they call it an African-American proverb. I'm not sure where it came from, but I'm sure many of you have heard it before. You have to work twice as hard to get half the credit. And so that's something that always, struck me. It's unfortunate, because I know not just people of color, but women have often felt that the way, that we have to work twice as hard to get half the credit. But I guess I really use him as an example. And looking at, if you'll remember the photo I took of him, he really had to be a role model for a lot of people, and not just for me. And so, if he knew that if he failed, that it was going to hurt other African-American officers who came after him in the military. So he always said, we had to be that, stand up and be that role model. And so he's always, even though he's passed away, he's somebody I always think of when I'm, being a mentor or working with other people. And so that, I always feel like I have to be way above the bar. But in any case, Priscilla, thanks so much for that question. Peg, what approaches have you found effective with people or groups for whom the moral argument is not compelling? Well, so yeah, and actually, if you go to, I believe in the reading guide, I have some links. There's actually Harvard Business Review studies that show that the diversity actually, and not just diversity, but like I think many of you have probably heard I'm sorry, I'm just going to fix my view on. There we go. So I can see everybody now. I've switched to gallery view. So hi, everybody. Now I can see some of you. Yes, go military brats. But so in terms of the moral argument, I think that like I said, there's Harvard Business Review studies that, and as women, we know that there's the studies that have shown if you have women in the boardroom, that you're more likely to get better outcomes as a business. And so there's lots of studies out there that talk about the fact that you can have both a business component to the argument as well as a moral component. But the one I think about is, California is already majority minority, especially amongst children in K through 12. And if we aren't educating those students, if we aren't, first of all, they're going to have a hard time. We're not going to have a workforce, right? But the second component, in terms of bringing people in, providing diversity, is just that you don't know what you're missing until you have actually brought those voices in. And so people will say, oh, we should just go for merit. We should just be a meritocracy. And I hear this all the time. We just need to hire the best candidate. Well, the reality is we all have our circles of people, and if you look at the data about how many people, like if you're a white person, unfortunately the odds are very low that you have a Black friend or a Hispanic friend. And so if we think about it from that perspective, you have to understand that the circles of people that are around you are limited. And so one of the words I use a lot is intentionality. And in order to get diversity, you really have to be intentional, which means you have to step outside of your comfort zone. You have to step outside of your friend group, of the people in order to actually find those people who maybe bring a different perspective into your business. One of I'll go back to an old story because that's one it always makes me laugh, which is when the Chevy Nova was created. They didn't think about the fact that Nova can also mean Nova, mean it doesn't go. Exactly, Amy. So that's one of my favorite examples. And we do this exercise in my radical empathy workshop about who's not in the room. And I think every board and every software developer and every person creating a product. Okay, women, think about the fact that when you get into your car, where do you put your purse? Imagine if there was a woman on the engineering team when they're designing that car, and she could step in and say, hey guys, we got all these cup holders, but where's a woman going to put her purse? It drives me crazy. So, and there's so many different things. This isn't even cultural. This is really basic, right? If you don't have the women engineers in the room, they aren't going to be able to tell you that women, and the funny thing is women are the biggest drivers of consumer purchasing, right? We're the ones out there buying everything. And yet, we aren't in we aren't in the places where we get to say this matters, or my kids aren't going to like that product because of X, Y, and Z, or this doesn't help me, and so I just, I really wish we could change that culture. I wish. I'm working on changing that culture, right? That's why I wrote this book and all. But it's really important, to understand, that having those people in the room and making sure that you're reaching out and getting different voices is going to improve your business in so many different ways, right? So there's the moral argument that we as a society should be doing more to create equity, but and that we're all individually each responsible for that. But there's also the business argument that you want a better product, you want a better customer service. You can't, if you're providing a product or you're providing a service, right, you want to make sure that you're getting all the voices there. Okay, so next question. What are some ways to overcome the uncomfortable feeling when having difficult conversations? And this is probably, again, a very, very important point. And I'd spend a lot of time on this and providing how to have those uncomfortable conversations. And one of the ways to do that is, first of all, be humble. And, it doesn't hurt to start off a conversation saying, look, I'm feeling a little uncomfortable discussing this, but do you mind if I ask you, this question? And it's interesting because, transparency, being honest, being a little vulnerable is really helpful. I think it's something that we all have a hard time with, because you don't want to show too much of yourself or anything. But as far as those uncomfortable and difficult conversations, that's where that vulnerability is going to be really critical, because you're basically saying, like you could say somebody wants to ask me about my hair. I wear my hair natural. It's like, well, gee, Terri, I'm really curious about your hair. Is it natural, or do you do something with it? And the interesting thing is the typical approach to that is, like, I was working with a girl who had, her hair was in long braids, and oh, your hair is so beautiful, it must take forever to do, and how do you get it to grow so long? Well, she obviously, to me, because I know it's she's using hair extensions, and it's kind of embarrassing to her to say that. But so in that situation, it would have been helpful to say, gee, you have beautiful hair, I'm just curious, how does it, and so start with that curiosity, right? And the other thing I often find is that even in these DEI workshops, people feel like they're being put on the defensive, and that's, and I'm just going to put that out there, because I know, people go into these workshops, they feel like they're being singled out or pointed at, and that's not the approach we want to have. And that's why that's one of the reasons I wrote this book, is because we've been doing these workshops and trainings for a long time, and we're not making progress. And so I was saying to myself, how can we approach this in a way that gets people off the defensive and says, look, we are all experiencing this? Because as I was writing the book, I was realizing, well, I have my own biases, right? If I don't recognize my own bias, then how can I tell somebody else that they need to deal with their bias? So part of it is acknowledging that we all have bias, and coming at it from a very humble and vulnerable position. And so, another, thing, with the George Floyd anniversary this week, I'm sure a lot of people are having a lot of emotion around it. And so there's, it's a very complicated thing, because I know for me, it can be a very emotional thing. And so the question is, ask, if you want to talk about it, but you're not sure, somebody is ready to, it's like, hey, do you mind if we talk about, and make it okay for them to say, no, I don't feel like talking about it right now. Like, and an easy way to do that is, hey, I'm interested in talking about this issue. But I understand if you're not ready to do that right now. And so the more you can kind of communicate and create a situation where the person has the option to say yes or no. And the other typical thing is, you'll be in a meeting and there's one Black person in the room, and something comes up about African Americans or something like that, and everybody turns and looks at the one African American in the room. Okay, so everyone who's listening to this, don't be that person who turns and looks at the African American. It's really important that we understand that we often put burdens, and I call it emotional labor, on when there's only one or two or just a few people of color in the space. And so just be aware. And if that does happen, say, it's like, oh, admit it. Be open, be honest about it. It's like, oh, sorry, Terri, we don't want to, just focus on you. This is an issue we all have to deal with. And, we all know this happens, and we deal with it, but it's nice to acknowledge that, we're doing it at the time, and say, look, we know you don't represent the entire Black race, but, and I wouldn't necessarily put it that way, but, don't make assumptions about people. That's the bottom line, and that goes in so many different directions. And I know this is really can be complicated, but like I said, starting from a space of understanding yourself and being willing to be vulnerable and being willing to be open and honest is the best, always the best route. And I do that myself as a leader. I always make sure, when I'm often dealing with people from cultures that I'm not familiar with, or don't necessarily know much about. And so first of all, think through, what is the question I want to ask, and how do I want to ask it? And so that awareness is just so important. So I'm happy to ask other questions, but in the meantime, just to talk a little bit more about, being a military brat. As I mentioned, I grew up in Spokane, Washington, and my father was at Fairchild Air Force Base. And so that's actually where I was born. And my parents decided to settle in Spokane, Washington. So one more story about issues of residential segregation. If you haven't checked it out yet, there's a great book called The Color of Law, and I'm going to forget the name of the author. But this is a really easy thing you can do is learn more about, first of all, you can check out this book as well as mine, but The Color of Law talks about residential segregation and redlining and all of that. And so, and often it's not redlining that, and what redlining is, for those who don't know, is when banks and insurance companies and so on basically put red lines around neighborhoods and said, we won't give mortgages or insurance to people Black people who try to buy houses in these neighborhoods. And so, but the book of The Color of Law actually talks about how basically the legal and banking and insurance systems were set up to keep Black people out of different neighborhoods. But when my parents decided to buy a home in Spokane, they went, somebody in the neighborhood went around to the other neighbors and tried to get them to buy the house out from under my parents. Luckily, they didn't do that, and we had wonderful neighbors who were very supportive and friendly. But that's the kind of thing you have to deal with. And when I bought my house in Austin, Texas, the real estate agent had to apologize when they gave us the deed, because the deed still says that Black people of African descent cannot buy a house in this neighborhood. And so That was disturbing, but of course it's not legal today, but it's part of the deed. So this was a house that was built in 1930. And so at that time, even the deed itself said that somebody who was African American could not buy a house in that neighborhood. And so that was very interesting. And then, when people, I have a very progressive neighborhood, even though it's predominantly white. And people have been very welcoming, but when I walk around, and this is, like I said, again, an exercise you can do is you walk around your neighborhood, look and see where you live and who's there and who isn't, and start asking why. And when you find out why, we need to figure out how we can do something to change that. So when I talk to my neighbors, so many of them have their Black Lives Matter signs, and I'm saying, okay, it's great, you got your Black Lives Matter sign, but what else are you doing? The interesting thing is, they often don't, even though they have the Black Lives Matter sign in their lawn, they don't really think about too much about the fact that there aren't any Black people in our neighborhood besides me. And yeah, absolutely. In the Bay Area, a huge amount of it is affordability. So I completely get that. And I feel incredibly blessed that, I've been done well enough that I can afford a home in this neighborhood. But, why is it that, there's still people here. So, we have to think about the history. And the fact it's not just that people, these neighborhoods were redlined and people weren't allowed to buy here, but the other component is, why aren't the Black people and brown people getting the jobs that would allow them to live in these neighborhoods? I was the first Black and woman to be the provost at Menlo College. I was the first Black woman to become a full professor and be a vice provost at UT Austin. So my generation is like the first that is finally breaking into these roles. Kamala Harris is the first Black person, first woman vice president. It's really interesting, and we need to think about the fact that we're witnessing all these first. The first Black a queer woman to be this, act as press secretary for the president. I could go over, and now on to McGill. So it's just been, I'm very proud of the fact that I've been the first, but I don't want to, as Kamala Harris says, I'm the first, but I don't want to be the last. And you guys we all have the power within us to create change. And that is an important message I'm trying to get across to you today. We have, in terms of higher education, we can see what's going on in terms of the changes within our workspaces. And, every single one of us has that power within us to create change. And so I want you to go out from this on a very hopeful note. I wrote this book because I believe in the power of humanity, and because I believe that people are good in their hearts and want to do good. And so, I know we've been living through some very difficult times. Every day there's something new, but I guess, because of the way I was raised and my belief in the golden rule is that we do have that power within us. And I see good, we see the bad, but I see good happening every day. I see, the students in the programs that I work on, going from being first generation college students to being first generation college graduates. I am a first generation college goer myself. And so I encourage every single one of you. Thank you. First of all, thank you for being here and being part of this. But, think about ways that you can really help create change. So unless there's any last questions, Annika, did you have any last questions or thoughts?
Terri, I can't thank you enough. I feel like you've given us so many tactical tips and so much guidance with hope behind it, that and a lot of resources to turn to. And thank you so much for your participation too in the summit. I think that's meant a lot to our attendees, that you're here as a keynote speaker, but you're also here participating, and there's so much that we can learn from you. So thank you again for being here. I so appreciate it. I don't see any more questions, so I think we can wrap up.
I know you guys have had a long few days. I just want to say one last thing, which is please don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have any questions or comments or thoughts. I'm very accessible, and you can find me all over social media. And hey, if you're on Clubhouse, join me there, because tomorrow I'm doing a Clubhouse room on radical empathy. So if you aren't on Clubhouse, join. It's fun.
I need to get over there. That sounds great. Thank you so much, Terri. Folks on the call, we'll see you at the award ceremony. And Terri, have a great weekend.
You too. Thank you so much.
Thanks again. Bye, everyone.